So these four lures I have in my hand right here are called jigs. Now the jig is a widely used fishing lure that for a long time I did not find a place for in my tackle box. I was confused by even the thought of how to work a jig, where to put the jig, how to get a good hook set with a jig, and I thought there's no way a fish would bite this over a Texas rig, I'll just throw a Senko. And boy was I wrong. In today's video, we're going to take a dive into the 4 styles of fishing jig heads and hopefully teach you guys how to catch some fish on every single one of these. And as the famous song goes, today we're getting jiggy with it.
What? Getting jiggy with it. What? Getting jiggy with it. What? Getting jiggy with it. What? You want to ball with the kids?
Well, how's it going, everybody, and welcome back to Tyler's Real Fishing. My name is Tyler, and I make it my goal on this channel to help you guys become better bass anglers. And as I said in the intro there, we're going to talk about the 4 jig head styles, where you can apply them in your lakes and ponds to catch more fish. And of course, with every single jig, I'm going to show you guys some fish catches. That way I can prove that I know what I'm talking about. But before we get into this topic, I have to talk about something that helps pay for these jigs, and that is money. And in order to make money, I gotta have sponsors. So today's video is sponsored by Ridge Wallets. As you all know, as a YouTuber, sponsors are incredibly important to have on the channel, and Ridge Wallets has been a faithful sponsor of this channel for the past few months. So what they are is a revolutionary 21st century style wallet. Get rid of that old-fashioned clunky wallet you got in your back pocket when you sit down, it's uncomfortable. Get yourself a Ridge wallet. Now, what makes this wallet so special? Well, it has room for 12 full-size cards and a strap for cash on the back. As you can see, you just kind of push up like this, pinch it, and all of your cards are easily within reach. Over the past few months of using this wallet, I have loved it. It is an incredible product, and I would highly recommend it. And don't take my word for it, they've got over 30,000 5-star reviews on their website. So if you guys want to order your own Ridge wallet and get 10% off your first order, I will have the link in the description below, as well as pinned to the top of the comments. The code is TRF. And yeah, supporting the sponsors on this channel is the best way, besides subscribing to the channel, to support this channel itself. So wallet plug aside, let's talk about jigs. Now, for those of you guys who don't know what a jig is, I want to touch on that really, really quickly. A jig is a combination of usually a metal, tungsten, or lead, most of the time it's lead, that is molded around a hook that has a weed guard into the head design itself. This here is an empty Outcast Tackle Cage Fighter jig head, and it is an Arky style head, as you'll hear me talk about in jig number 1 on this list. Jigs are really versatile. They can be fished in all sorts of places, but I have 4 that I'm gonna talk about today. Now, I do not in this video get into the types of trailers you need. I will have all of those linked below with the jigs that I talk about in the description, but I made a whole video on jig trailers themselves, because with jigs, you need a trailer to go on the back of a jig. That's just the way that it's designed. You can catch fish without a trailer, but I'm just telling you, you're gonna catch way more with a trailer on there. And so I made a whole video on jig trailers themselves, and I will have that linked below as well as up in the corner. So let's talk about the jigs. So the order in which we're gonna talk about these jigs is an order of most effective and most widely utilized to more niche. I wouldn't say less effective, it's just less situations in which you can throw those jigs. And so starting at jig number 1, we're gonna talk about the standard or Arky style jig head. This right here is a standard style jig head. They come in all sorts of different sizes and shapes, but the general name surrounding them is called the Arky head, A-R-K-Y. Maybe it was A-R-K-I-E back in the day, but there was a lure company called Arky Jigs way back in the day, not even sure if they still exist. But that company, to my knowledge, pioneered this style of head. Whether the line tie is vertical or horizontal, these are all basically called Arky style jig heads because they can be fished in all different scenarios. This is the Outcast Tackle Juice Jig, and I love throwing this jig basically anywhere. In grass, wood, skipping under docks, even around rocks. This thing is just so versatile, and that is what makes this jig so great. You can throw it anywhere, and you can even retrieve it in whichever way the fish are dictating they want the jig retrieved. So you can swim it, you can hop it, you can drag it. It is really an all-purpose jig. And because of that, it is a fish catching machine. I have caught so many fish on a standard style jig head, and by that I mean it's just a rounded sides, usually a little bit of a flat bottom. Doesn't have to be totally flat. That way it sits on the bottom a little bit easier. Usually just a standard style skirt material. Nothing is cut shorter or longer, and it's just a fish catcher. Now, the gear that is best for throwing a standard style jig like this, of course, depends on how heavy the jig is and how heavy cover you're fishing in. So if I'm just fishing open water with a little bit of grass, a little bit of wood, I like to throw a standard Arky style jig on a 7.2 to 7.3 heavy action rod with a fast action tip. I want a little bit of soft tip. I don't want extra fast because I want to be able to kind of feel what's down there on the bottom, but I still want the heavy action rod to be able to set the hook hard. And that's going to be the thread across all of these jigs besides the finesse jig. All these jigs, you're going to have to set the hook hard, and that just takes learning. So let's hop on the front deck and show you guys how to fish the standard Arky style jig head. So the Arky style head, like I mentioned, is one of the most versatile jig heads out there. You can really do just about anything with it. I love throwing it around grass, around wood, and there's tons of different shapes and styles, especially that Outcast makes. I love the Cage Fighter for docks, I love the Stealth Fighter for grass, and the Juice just for any sort of all-around pond fishing situations usually, and any sort of scattered vegetation and grass. That's where I like to throw the Juice jig. But the way that you work it really depends on the situation. So I'm going to skip it under this dock right here after I get my backlash out. The way that I like to retrieve it in these situations, and really most of the time, is I'm going to reel down, I'm going to kind of hop it up and let it sink. Maybe do 1 or 2 hops, reel in my line and let it sink. Lift it up, oh, I got some grass, kind of got to shake it out of the grass and let it sink. Most Arky style heads, I am hopping. I'm not usually swimming them. You can drag them as well, as I'll talk about the football jig, but I like to just do little hops like this. Imagine it being a crawfish or a bluegill that's kind of hopping off the bottom, kind of living his, jolly old life, not expecting to get bit. But just like that, skip it under there, give it 1 or 2 hops, let it sink. Sometimes I'll do a slower pull up, but it's mostly a, rod in front of me like this, reeling down, pulling up, and letting it sink back down. It just depends on how fast you want to do that. Whether you want to do fast little jigs or you want to do slow hops up and down, there's tons of great ways to work it. Now when you get a bite, you're going to either feel a thump or you're just going to feel something different. You're going to reel down as far down as you can go and just give them the business. That's going to be, oh, almost hit the camera there. That's going to be a constant with almost all the jigs besides the finesse jig. You just want to set the hook hard. I don't care if you think you're a hard hook setter, you could always be a harder one. And so that's my one advice for hook sets on jigs that I didn't quite understand when I was first bass fishing, is that if you can set the hook harder, set the hook harder. But working a normal style jig head is just super simple. So don't overcomplicate it, hop it up and down, let those fish see it, and when they bite, give them the business. Oh yeah. There he is. That was perfect. That was perfect. I love it. I love it. So the second jig on our list is going to be the swim jig. The swim jig, as its name implies, is designed to be swam through the water. Now you can tell immediately by looking at this B-roll shot that I have on the screen, the swim jig head is different than the Arky style. It is not a round head anymore, it is more of a cylinder. I would classify it more as a cylinder or a cone rather than a round head. And I'm going to take a much deeper dive into the swim jig in a video coming out very soon. As a matter of fact, it might already be out by the time this video comes out. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure that I have a video on every single one of these besides maybe the football jig that I will link below. That way you guys can understand when I go into a deeper dive into how to fish these things. This video is just kind of an overview, and, for people that have never fished a jig before and you just want to get a good head start. That's what this video is for. So had to give a little plug out of the way. And so because the swim jig is usually a relatively lighter head design, it is meant to be swam in the top of the water column. Usually, in my experience, a foot to 3 foot beneath the water, sometimes even less than a foot. I'm reeling it literally on the water's surface within the first 4 inches of the water column and getting those fish to come out of shallow cover and eat it. Now when it comes to the swim jig, I don't always have to throw a heavy action rod, especially if I'm in sparse vegetation. I can throw a 7'3" medium heavy. If you're really target casting with it, I would go with a 7 foot or a 6'10". You just want to make sure you have enough backbone to get the hook into those fish. Swim jig works better for me on shorter casts because because I can set the hook and really get the fish out of that shallow cover. But especially if I'm fishing around lily pad, like hard lily pads, any sort of bushes or trees, I want to be throwing a heavy action rod. Very similar, very similar to the one that I throw the Arky style jig head on. I'm going to throw the swim jig on, and a lot more often I'm throwing braided line on a swim jig than I am on the Arky style. So let's go on the front deck real quick and show you guys how to fish the swim jig. Now, when fishing a swim jig, you literally just want to swim it. I go into a much deeper dive in my swim jig specific video that I'll have linked below at some point. But when you're casting it out there, of course, you want to pick an area that has shallow cover, shallower than any other jig can go, and that's usually where I'm throwing a swim jig. So in really shallow lily pads, shallow grass, underneath super shallow docks, where other jigs would just make too much commotion. A swim jig really shines, and that's mostly due to the trailer on the back. I love having a rage crawl on the back of my swim jigs or a rage menace. But up here, we got some really shallow grass. The bass in Minnesota are moving shallow because it's the fall. I love throwing a swim jig in the fall. So I'm gonna make a really long cast over that stuff and start my retrieve right away. You know, with the, I'll show you the difference here. With the Arky style head, I would have made a cast over that grass right there, and I would have let it sunk to the bottom, because that's what you're supposed to do with most jigs. I would have been hopping it off the bottom like this, and that definitely has its place, but not this shallow. This shallow, you want to keep that swim jig looking like a bluegill with his tail kicking on the top of the water column, and any bass with his eyes on the top of his head is looking up, sees that jig pass by, and charges it and eats it. Some swim jig bites that I get are absolutely unreal. They knock slack in the line, and thus you need a high speed gear ratio reel to do that. Usually an 8:3 to 1 or a 7:5 to 1, any faster gear ratio, and make sure that you have a good handle on there to be able to really reel fast to catch up to those fish, as you'll see from some of the fish catches in my swim jig video. I'm gonna cast swim jig out there, switch hands in midair, and start my retrieve with my rod tip high. Literally as soon as that jig hits the water in this situation. Now, if you're fishing in, I don't know, 4 or 5 feet of water and you want the swim jig to go a few feet under, of course, let it sink for a second or two. But right here, I don't. I want it to be right on the top of the water column. So I have switched hands in midair. I'm keeping the rod tip high, because with the rod tip high, it allows that bait to swim higher up in the water column. And it is a covering water bait. Now, it's not covering water with a lot of vibration and sound as the chatterbait and spinnerbait do, or the square bill as well, but it covers water in more of a finesse type situation. And I've just found that there's so many times when bass see so many spinnerbaits and chatterbaits, but they don't see a whole lot of swim jigs, especially up in that really nasty cover where nobody else can even throw their lure. That's where I think the swim jig excels. So like you're seeing me here, I'm literally just reeling it straight back in, keeping that jig as high in the water column as I can, letting the crawls on the trailer do all the action. Not a whole lot of rod, you know, oh, that was a fish. I've got one. No way, I knew I did. As you can tell, hopefully you can see, you might not be able to see from that camera angle, but it is so shallow up there. No other jig could be effective up there. I mean, you couldn't hop a jig off the bottom because there's not really a bottom to hop off of. It is basically bottom once you hit the water. That right there shows you the swim jig catches them. And I didn't even hardly do anything on that cast besides start my retrieve, and that fish came and nabbed it. Now, there will be some times when you want to give that jig a little bit more action than just swimming it back in with the trailer kicking. So I'm gonna cast it out there, start my retrieve, and literally just pulsate my rod tip, but basically as fast as I can, while still reeling with my right hand, and it causes that jig skirt to just flare the whole way back in, and that can trigger some really reactive strikes from bass that oftentimes would not bite if that jig was just swimming by. I think most of the time, literally swimming the jig back in and occasionally giving it a pop or pausing your reel is good enough, but of course there's so many ways to work the swim jig, and it's also really versatile. I can skip the swim jig around docks, I can fish it around grass. I mean, you know, if I've got a bank line of grass that I've been working the swim jig around and I get to a dock, I don't necessarily have to pick up an Arky style jig head to skip under the dock. I can just go ahead and skip the swim jig because it is pretty good as well for fishing underneath docks. And just like that, you guys understand how to fish a swim jig. Like I mentioned, we're gonna have a really fun video coming out that you guys are gonna wanna see from the swim jig. Probably caught like 20 fish in that video, so it's gonna be super awesome. But that is how to fish a swim jig. Enjoy these fish catches.
Gosh! Watched him eat it. Watched him eat it. Watched him eat it. Get in the boat. Yes! Let's go!
Oh. Oh gosh.
It's a pike, I think. It's gotta be. Oh, he's fat. He's fat.
Jig number 3 on our list, and my favorite for catching big bass in deeper water, is the football jig. The football jig is a surefire way to make sure that your fishing day ends with a game-winning touchdown. That was a bad joke. Horrible joke. But the football jig has nothing to do with football itself, besides the fact that the shape is actually has everything to do with a football. The head of the jig actually looks like a football does. If you were to take a football and you were to hold it out like this, like a lot of, I don't know, quarterbacks do on TV, that is the way that the head of the jig is sitting. It is sitting perpendicular to the hook. The hook is sitting this way, the football jig head is sitting this way. A lot of other jig heads sit in line with or parallel with the hook. The football jig sits the opposite way. And the reasoning for this is because this jig is meant to be fished in deeper water and is meant to displace the bottom. So most jigs you don't want dragging across the bottom, pulling up muck and moving rocks, but the football jig you do. You want to create a trail of dust down there for those fish to be able to find your jig and eat it. This jig is meant to be in their face, not in the same way the swim jig is, where it's like a reaction style lure. You just want this thing to be sitting down there, dragging across those rocks and wood, and getting in that fish's area where he has no choice but to eat it. With most of the other jigs that I like to keep around a half an ounce, I love to throw a 3/4 ounce football jig. That way I can get really long casts and really make sure my jig is staying down on the bottom, because with all these jigs, besides the swim jig, it's very important your jig stays on the bottom, and when you're in deep water, it's really easy for your pull on your jig when you're dragging it or hopping it to pull it off the bottom. I want to make sure that my jig is staying on the bottom as much as possible. Now the gear that you need for a football jig really doesn't vary all that much from a regular jig like the swim jig or an Arky style, but it can. So you can get away with throwing a regular style jig or a swim jig on a 7-foot, medium heavy that technically could work. I prefer to throw a little bit longer of a rod, but you can get away with that. On a football jig, you really can't. You might be able to catch some fish, but you're gonna have a hard time setting the hook in deeper water with a shorter rod. And so I like to throw at minimum a 7'3". 7'4" or 7'6" is really my go-to rod when it comes to throwing a football jig, a 7'6" heavy. And make sure that rod is a heavy action rod. The line size that I'm usually throwing with a football jig is 17-pound fluorocarbon. Occasionally, I'll jump up to 20-pound if I'm throwing it around brush piles out deep or submerged trees. But most of the time, it's 17-pound. I have found that's enough to get the hook into those fish. Of course, dirty water, you can get away with braid. But I love throwing fluorocarbon for almost all my jigs if I can get away with it. And as always, I will have all of this information linked below. I'll have the jig, the rod and reel with that jig, as well as the line that you need for at least most scenarios. So let's hop on the front deck and show you guys how to fish a football jig. So the first step in working a football jig is making a long cast. Football jigs are meant to be, I would say, almost like very slow water covering lures. So you want to cover as much water as possible, but of course still retrieving that jig very, very slowly with the drag across the bottom. And so make a long cast out there as I did, and I'm going to let the jig sink to the bottom, all the way to the bottom. Make sure it's there. I cannot be more serious about that. Make sure the jig is on the bottom. And then slowly drag the jig across the bottom, feeling any grass, rocks, wood that's down there. And I can't reiterate enough how slowly, for the most part, you want to retrieve the jig. Sometimes I'll kind of speed it up, give it a little bit of a jerk or a pull here and there, but most times I just want to feel what's down there on the bottom, and that is best done with the rod tip down, dragging slowly, just like this, almost always watching my rod tip to see if that rod tip jumps, as in a fish taking a swipe at it. And oftentimes with a football jig, you're not going to feel a distinct thump as you do with, let's say, a flipping jig, you're skipping underneath docks. You're just going to kind of feel that jig get heavy, and you're going to kind of keep pulling and feel, well, is that a rock? I don't know, it doesn't really feel like a rock, and it's always good to just set the hook in check. Oftentimes, that's not a rock, that's a fish. So I'm out of the rocky area, so I'm gonna reel in. I'm gonna make another really long cast. Move my line over so the jig falls straight, and then peel out some line to make sure that thing can get to the bottom.
Oh gosh, what a fish. There's one. Got it. Perfect. I have pinpointed where the fish are.
Now the last jig on our list, and the most specialized in my opinion, but definitely has a tendency to catch some really, really good fish, is the finesse jig. Now you'll notice right away the finesse jig is a different style of jig. At least in most cases, it is a more ball style head. It is round. This one by Outcast here, which by the way, we have another one coming soon, a little prototype. This one is not the prototype, but most finesse jigs are round or round-ish style head, and usually meant to be fished on the bottom where they can kind of stand up and just kind of hop slowly across the bottom. So I'll show you how I work a finesse jig here in a second. But it is just a fish catcher when the rest of these jigs are not working. When you had a cold front blow through, you've got colder water, you've got really, really clear water, and small crawfish and small bluegill. I'm talking like 1 to 2 inch little bait fish and little crawfish. That is where the finesse jig comes into play. Now the jig on a finesse jig, at least this one here, is still relatively heavy wire, but it's not as heavy wire as some of the other jigs. And I know there's a lot of finesse jigs out there on the market that have really, really thin wire hooks. So when it comes to the gear that I throw a finesse jig on, it is usually a 7-foot medium heavy. I don't like to throw a super long rod on it. You don't need a heavy action rod for a finesse jig. It is a smaller profile jig and thus doesn't necessitate a super strong hook set. And especially with how light, like this jig here is 3/16 of an ounce, I like to throw it on a smaller bait caster or a spinning rod. That way I can make long casts with it. You'll also notice that the skirt on most finesse jigs is cut on the top. So the bottom side is longer, about to the edge of the hook, which is actually quite shorter than most jigs are. I mean, if you look at the football jig, the skirt goes a whole inch past the bottom of the hook. You only have about, at least on this one here, maybe 1/2 inch on the top of the finesse jig, and it kind of circles and makes a little halo around the jig head. That way when it sits on the bottom, it just kind of flares out, and it's not a huge profile, isn't really menacing, but gets those fish that are really finicky and not quite willing to bite anything else to bite the finesse jig. Let's finish out the video with a few fish catches and showing you guys how to catch fish on the finesse jig. Now the finesse jig is not meant to be fished around anything else in my experience besides rocks. Rocks are where the finesse jig shines, and I think that's really the only place I've ever thrown it, maybe accidentally thrown it around some grass or wood, but it does not have usually a thick enough weed guard to stand up to any sort of wooded conditions, and the head design does not fit well with grass. Any sort of ball head or flat head design, as this jig has right here, just does not fish well around grass. So rocks are where it shines. We don't have any rocks today. We're in Minnesota. They don't really have a whole lot of rock in the Twin Cities, Minnesota. So I'm still gonna show you guys though how to work it. So I'm gonna cast the finesse jig out there, let it sink to the bottom, you dingus. And one way that helps let it sink to the bottom is keeping your bail open. Don't click your reel and reel in your slack as soon as the bait hits the water. You want that bait to fall on a slack line, not just to look natural for the fish that eat it on the drop, but also to make sure that your cast is as long as possible, because the earlier you click your reel down, the more your line kind of pendulums that lure back to you, and you're gonna lose some of your casting distance. So stop doing that in every aspect, not just finesse jig fishing, but any sort of Texas rig or jig. I'm gonna reel down. I'm going to put my rod tip at, I don't know, if you were to look at a clock, it's probably 10 or 11 o'clock between those two, and I'm just gonna kind of shake it. Very, very, not I wouldn't say very quickly, but very, very small little shakes, almost like you were doing a shaky head. If you were to spin it upside down, a shaky head on a spinning rod. That's the same thing I'm doing with a finesse jig, is I'm barely kind of shaking it like this, causing that jig to barely kind of hop along the bottom. Looks like a little crawfish or a bluegill that's kind of injured and wobbling across the bottom. And when I get a bite on a finesse jig, I'm not gonna reel down and whack on them. I'm gonna reel down and just kind of lean into them. Then you can reel down and give them kind of a secondary hook set. But usually most finesse jigs don't have a really, really heavy wire hook, and so you don't wanna absolutely rail on them and give them the business. Small little hops, and every, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 hops, you're gonna reel in a little bit of line. Occasionally, you know, you can give it a little bit of a bigger hop, or maybe you can kind of drag it across the bottom and shake it. Most of the time, I am just doing little tiny shakes, much like I'm doing a shaky head, but instead it's with a jig. So I hope all this stuff made sense to you guys and you learned something in today's video. Tons of fish catches, tons of instruction. That's what this channel is all about. So if you guys are new here, hit that subscribe button. If you learned something, let me know in the comments, because I want to know that what I'm doing is not falling on deaf ears. I want to make sure you guys are understanding and learning and becoming better anglers. If you guys want to see me cover any of these videos in even more depth, I already have the swim jig and plenty on the Arky style jigs, but of course, jigs are one of my favorite ways to catch big bass all around the country, and I hope it becomes that way for you guys. We'll see you next time on TRF.